The confrontation. It was a quiet afternoon at the cafe. The kind where the only noise came from the clinking of coffee cups and soft chatter. But the peaceful atmosphere shattered in an instant. The woman, her face twisted in disgust, pointed her finger towards the black girl sitting near the window. "That seat is for paying customers only," she sneered, her voice laced with a condescending tone. The girl, no older than 16, didn't flinch. She was used to this, the whispers, the stares, and the occasional verbal attack. But today, it was different. The girl's eyes locked onto the woman's, a spark of defiance in her gaze. She refused to move. "I'm paying for this seat, just like anyone else," she said calmly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. The woman's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, really?" she scoffed, stepping closer. "You really think you belong here?" The words struck like a slap, but the girl stood her ground. "Yes, I do," she replied firmly, holding her head high. It was then that the woman's face turned red with anger. She flicked her hair back and stormed up to the barista, demanding the girl be removed. "What is going on here?" The voice came from the doorway, sharp and authoritative. The woman froze. From behind her, a tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He moved past her without a word, heading straight to the girl's table. His hand went to his jacket pocket, pulling out a badge that gleamed in the dim light. "I suggest you leave her alone," the man said, his voice calm but firm. The woman's smirk faltered. Her eyes darted between the badge and the man's cold, determined face. She knew that badge, the FBI. Her body stiffened. The color drained from her face as she finally realized the truth. The man was not just a random bystander. He was someone she would never have the nerve to mess with. The unraveling truth. The woman stood frozen, her mind racing as the realization hit her. With the force of a freight train, she had just confronted the wrong person. Her eyes flicked nervously to the badge in the man's hand, and then back to the girl. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The man's gaze remained steady, unblinking. His presence alone filled the space with authority. The tension in the cafe thickened. Every eye was now on them. The air seemed to hum with the promise of something coming, something that would shatter the illusion of the perfect. "Afternoon, do you have a problem with my daughter?" The man's voice was quiet but carried weight. Each syllable seemed to demand respect. The woman's face flushed a deeper shade of red. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself unable to form the words. She had underestimated this situation. Her mind scrambled for a response, but all that came out was a strangled attempt at a defensive laugh. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her eyes darting around the cafe for any sign of support from the onlookers. But they were silent, their gazes fixed on her as though they were waiting for her to make the next move. The girl's hand clenched around her coffee cup, her grip tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She could feel the burn of the woman's hatred, but her father's presence gave her the strength to hold her ground. She knew this wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about power. It was about the fight for her right to exist in a space where people like the woman saw her as lesser than. "Let me make it clear for you," the man continued, his voice unwavering. "This is my daughter, and you will respect her, or I will make sure you regret this moment." The woman's eyes widened. She looked at the badge once more, and in that fleeting second, she realized exactly who she was dealing with. The man standing before her wasn't just any father. He was an FBI agent, someone with the power to ruin her in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. "I didn't mean it like that." Her voice trembled now, her previous confidence slipping away. "I was just trying to help. I didn't realize she was." "You didn't realize she was what?" The man interrupted, his tone sharp. "What exactly were you expecting her to be?" The woman's mouth snapped shut at the weight of the question. She had no answer. She had assumed that the girl didn't belong here. She had assumed that the girl didn't deserve the space she occupied. She had assumed that her race made her less than the man. Didn't wait for a response. He looked at the barista, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, and nodded slightly. "I'll handle this from here," he said, his eyes returning to the woman who was now shrinking in on herself. "You've made a mistake," he continued, his gaze never leaving her face, "and you're going to pay for it, but not in the way you think." The woman's pulse quickened. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the cafe on her. Now she could hear the soft whispers behind her back, people speculating about what would happen next. She wanted to run, but she knew it was too late. There was no escape from the moment she had created. The girl sat quietly watching her father with a calmness that belied the storm raging in her chest. She had seen this before. The The way people looked at her, the way they thought they could control her, the way they assumed they had the right to decide where she belonged. But today was different. Today her father wasn't just any man today. He was someone who could turn the tables. Leave, the man said, his voice final, the single word, carrying more weight than 100 commands. Leave, before I make this a public issue, and it's on the news. Tomorrow morning. The woman stood there for a long moment, the fight draining out of her. With each passing second she opened her mouth, as if to say something, but nothing came out. Her pride was gone, her confidence shattered, and all that was left was a hollow apology that she couldn't even bring herself to voice. With one last look at the girl, she turned and walked out of the cafe, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed as though she had just been stripped of everything. She thought. She knew the man didn't watch her go. His attention was already on his daughter, who had slowly stood up from her seat, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding between them. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. The girl nodded slowly, her face a mask of calm, but her eyes betrayed the turmoil within her. She had never understood why some people thought they had the right to treat others as if they were less, why the color of her skin could make people feel superior. "I'm fine, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but her father saw the crack in her composure. He saw the hurt that she tried so hard to hide, the weight of the words she had just endured. "You don't have to deal with that ever again," he said, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I won't let anyone make you feel small." She smiled faintly at him, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She wanted to believe him, she really did, but deep down she knew that this wouldn't be the last time. She faced hate, that this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to diminish her worth because of something she couldn't control. But for now she had her father by her side, and that gave her a little peace. The awakening. The cafe was quieter now. The hum of conversation had settled into whispers, the tension of moments before lingering in the air like smoke. But the girl felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She could feel her father's presence beside her, like an unspoken promise of protection, even as the world outside seemed to shrink her down to something insignificant. She looked up at him, his tall frame casting a shadow over her, and felt a spark of something deeper than gratitude, something that felt like the first breath of air after being submerged too long. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You handled that better than I ever could have when I was your age." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked at the door where the woman had exited. Her head was spinning. The confrontation had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She wasn't afraid of standing up for herself, but she had never been put in a situation like that before. She had never faced someone so openly hostile and unrepentant. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted quietly. "I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her everything I've been feeling, but I just stayed silent." Her father smiled, a small knowing smile that reached his eyes. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words," he said. "Sometimes holding your ground without reacting is the most powerful thing you can do." She nodded slowly, still processing the whirlwind of emotions that had overtaken her, but his words made sense. They calmed the storm inside her and reminded her that she didn't have to fight every battle with anger. Sometimes you could win simply by existing. The barista, who had been watching them for the last few minutes, now walked over, a hesitant look in his eyes, as if he were unsure whether to speak up or not. He cleared his throat and addressed the man directly. "Excuse me, sir. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for what happened earlier," he said, his voice sincere but still nervous. "No one should ever have to go through something like that, and I just wanted to make sure you know that we don't tolerate that kind of behavior." Here the girl's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, especially not a stranger, but the barista's words seemed genuine, and she could feel a warmth spreading through her chest at the unexpected kindness. Her father gave a slight nod, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said simply, "but you don't need to apologize for someone else's actions." The barista smiled weakly. "I just want you to know that not everyone thinks like her," he said. "There are still good people out there who care." For the first time that afternoon, the girl felt a flicker of hope stir inside her. It wasn't much, but it was something, a reminder that not everyone saw her through the lens of hatred, that there were still people who would stand up for what was right. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder once more. "Let's get out of here," he said. "We've earned a little peace today." As they walked out of the cafe, the girl took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the street before them. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. But despite everything that had happened, she felt something different today. She felt as if she could face whatever came next. Her father had always been her rock, but today, he had shown her something more. He had given her the courage to stand tall in a world that often tried to push her down. But as they walked through the city's bustling streets, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She knew that the woman's anger had only been the beginning of something bigger, something that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. "Dad," she said after a long silence, "do you think it will ever stop?" He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something there, something that made her heart ache. "I wish I could say yes," he replied, his voice tinged with regret, "but the truth is, we don't get to choose when it ends. We just have to keep pushing forward, keep standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." She nodded, but the doubt still lingered in her mind. She had seen how quickly people could turn on her, how easily they could dismiss her worth based on the color of her skin, and she wondered if that would ever change. If the world would ever see her as anything more than what they assumed her to be. But then she remembered her father's words and the strength she had felt. In that moment, the way he had stood by her without hesitation, the way he had used his power not to control her but to protect her, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to hope maybe change wasn't as impossible as it seemed. Maybe all it took was one person standing up for what was right to set things in motion. When they reached the car, her father opened the door for her with a gentle smile. "Home sweet home," he said as she slid into the seat and buckled her seatbelt. She looked out the window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the world with new eyes. She wasn't just a victim of the hate that surrounded her. She was a force in her own right, a force that could change the narrative, rewrite the rules, and show the world that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. The road stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities, and as they drove away from the cafe, the girl knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. She was ready for whatever came next, because, with her father by her side, and the strength of her own voice, she knew she could face anything. The ripple effect. The next few days were filled with a sense of surreal calm. The world outside seemed to go on as it always had, but within her the girl felt something shifting. It wasn't as if the events of the cafe had disappeared. It wasn't as though the pain had just vanished. No, it was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but now she had something new, a sense of clarity. It was as though her father's words had unlocked a door inside her, a door she hadn't even known existed, a door that revealed a path she could walk even when everything around her seemed to be fighting against. Ichi woke up early one morning, a soft light filtering through her bedroom window, and as she lay there staring up at the ceiling, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The fight wasn't over. No, it was only just beginning. But the battle didn't need to be fought with anger. It didn't need to be fought with fists or words. No, it had to be fought with something deeper, with purpose. She had always known who she was, but it wasn't until that moment that she truly understood her own strength. How powerful she could be, just by existing in spaces that didn't want her there, simply by walking into a room and standing tall against the odds. The world was never going to change unless people like her stood up for it, unless people like her refused to shrink back into the shadows simply because it was easier than fighting for what was right. And so the fight began anew, but this time it wasn't about confronting the woman in the cafe or any of the other countless ignorant souls who looked at her and saw only a stereotype. No, it was about something bigger. It was about showing the world that she would not be silenced. The girl spent the next few days in quiet preparation. She poured herself into her schoolwork, not because she needed to prove something to anyone, but because she wanted to show herself that she could succeed on her own terms. She spent time reading books she'd put off for too long and engaging in conversations with friends she had once been afraid to speak to, as if their silence could somehow shield her from the truth of what was happening. But it wasn't enough to just keep quiet. No, that would never have been enough, and she knew it. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table working through an essay, her father walked in. He had a quiet smile on his face, a knowing look in his eyes. He could see the fire that was burning within her, even if she didn't yet fully realize it herself. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone casual, but there was something in his voice that made her look up. "About what happened the other day." She put her pen down and turned to face him, her heart quickening ever so slightly. She had no idea where he was going with this, but she was certain it was something important. "Don't worry," he said with a chuckle, sensing her unease. "I'm not going to tell you to forget about it. That's not what I do." She relaxed slightly, but remained silent. waiting for him to continue. "I've been working with a few people on a project," he went on. "It's about bringing attention to the racial issues we've been facing in the community and how we can start changing the way people think." The girl raised an eyebrow. "And what's your part in all of this?" Her father smiled even wider. "I want you to help me with it." For a moment she didn't say anything. The idea of standing up and speaking out in such a public way was terrifying. But at the same time, something about it felt right. It felt like the next step in her journey, the next step in becoming who she was meant to be. "Help you with what?" she asked. "Finally, help me create a campaign." He said something that shows the power of standing together against hate, something that shows people like that woman in the cafe that we will not back down. The words were a spark, a sudden flash of inspiration that lit a fire within her, something she had never felt before. It wasn't just about one confrontation. It wasn't just about one small victory. No, this was bigger than that. This was about setting a precedent for future generations. This was about changing the very fabric of society and how it treated people like her. The girl looked at her father, and for the first time in a long while she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like the world was too big for her. She felt as though she could take on anything, and when she stood up from the table, with a new sense of determination, "I'm in." Her father nodded, his pride evident in his gaze. "I knew you would be spent." The next few days, in a flurry of activity, the girl found herself researching racial inequality in the workplace. In education, in media, she learned about the history of civil rights movements and how they had shaped the world she lived in, and how much further there was to go. Through it all, her father was there, guiding her, encouraging her, but never forcing her to take on more than she was ready for. He knew this was her fight, to win or lose, but he was always by her side. The campaign they created was nothing short of powerful. It wasn't just a message of defiance, it was a call to action, a call for people to look within themselves and ask the hard questions. Why do we accept hate? Why do we allow it to go unchallenged? Why do we let people like that woman in the cafe dictate the spaces we occupy? The video they created went viral almost overnight. It wasn't just a message from one person, it was a message from an entire community, an entire generation of young people who were ready to rise up and say enough was enough. For the girl, it was an awakening, a realization that her voice mattered, that her story mattered, and that no matter how much the world tried to push her down, she would always find a way to rise above it. The campaign sparked conversations across the country. People were talking about race in ways they hadn't before, and for once the girl felt like she wasn't invisible, that the world was starting to see her for who she truly was. It wasn't a perfect world, and it wasn't an easy journey, but the girl had made a choice. She had chosen to fight for herself, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And with her father by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, she would never stop fighting for what was right. The turning point: the morning after the campaign video went viral, the girl could barely contain the excitement that bubbled inside her. She awoke to dozens of messages flooding her phone from friends, family, even strangers who had seen the video and shared their support for her message. The notifications didn't stop for hours, her phone buzzing incessantly as people rallied behind the cause. Her father had always known that this moment would come, but seeing it happen in real time still took him by surprise. They sat together at the kitchen table that morning, he with his coffee and she with her laptop, both of them scrolling through the comments on the campaign video. The sheer volume of support was overwhelming, but what struck her most were the personal stories. People shared from all walks of life, sharing their experiences of discrimination and inequality, stories that echoed her own in ways she hadn't expected. She had scrolled, slowly pausing to read each comment, taking in the words with a heaviness that left her heart aching, but also filled with determination. There was no turning back now. The movement had begun, and she was right at the center of either. Father watched her carefully, noticing the mixture of pride and sorrow in her expression. He could see that the weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. He had known from the start that this fight would require more than just strength of will. It would require endurance, it would require resilience, and most of all, it would require them both to stand firm, even when the world seemed to push back. "You know, this is just the beginning, right?" he said, his voice steady, but filled with an understanding she hadn't quite grasped yet. "I know," she replied quietly, without looking up from her screen, her fingers scrolling, but her mind already a few steps ahead. She knew this moment would bring change, but she also knew that with that change would come resistance. She could feel the subtle shift in the air around her. As the support grew stronger, so too did the opposition. She had already seen the subtle comments, the hate messages from people who saw her video as an attack on their beliefs, on their way of life. She could feel the pushback, like a dark cloud hovering on the horizon, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it would break, and it did by the end of the week. The phone calls started coming in from news outlets and journalists eager to interview her. They wanted to hear her side of the story. They wanted to know more about the campaign and what had motivated her to take such a bold stand. And as each interview request came in, she could feel the weight of the decision she had made settling deeper on her shoulders. This wasn't just about a single moment anymore. It wasn't just about standing up to one woman in a cafe or putting out a video for attention. No, this had become something much bigger. It was about raising awareness about the systemic issues that plagued society. It was about making sure that the world knew her voice mattered, that her story mattered, and that she wasn't afraid to speak up for what was right. Her father could see the strain in her eyes, the hesitation in her every movement, as the pressure of everything she had started began to settle in. He knew how hard this would be, how much she would have to sacrifice if she wanted to continue on this path, but he also knew that there was no turning back for her. "This is what you've been waiting for," he said, his voice softening as he reached across the table to place a hand on hers. "Don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. We'll face this together." And in that moment she realized something she hadn't before. She had never been truly alone in this fight. Sure, she had felt isolated at times, but her father had always been there guiding her, even when she didn't know she needed it. He had been the steady hand on her back, the unwavering support in the face of doubt, and now she knew that together they could face whatever came next. But as the days went on, the storm she had feared began to rise. It started small at first, with comments and posts from people who were uncomfortable with her message, who thought she was taking things too far, that she was making a mountain out of a molehill. But soon those whispers grew louder and more hostile as the hate groups began to rally against her. They called her names, they twisted her words, they painted her as an enemy of progress, and before long the backlash was impossible to ignore. They didn't just attack her message, they attacked her. They dug into her past. They found old photos and videos they could use against her, anything they could to discredit her and destroy her credibility. They launched a smear campaign designed to tear her down and make her question whether she had made the right choice. It was the hardest part of the journey so far. It was the part where doubt crept in and threatened to take hold. It was the part where she wondered if the world was truly ready for change, or if it was always going to stay stuck in its ways. And then one night, after a particularly vicious round of insults on social media, she sat alone in her room staring at the screen of her phone, feeling the sting of every word, every attack. Her father found her there later that evening, his hand on the doorframe as he watched her sit in silence, her face pale, her eyes vacant. He knew what she was feeling. He had seen it before, in the eyes of other activists who had come before her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before looking up at him. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she had been carrying. Her father walked into the room and sat beside her on the bed, his presence a comforting warmth in the cold space. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently, "but you also don't have to keep fighting if it's hurting you." She turned to him, her eyes filled with uncertainty and pain. "But I've come so far. Dad, how can I just walk away now? How can I stop when it feels like we're finally making a difference?" His gaze softened as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to take a break. It's okay to step back when the fight becomes too much. But remember this," he said, "your worth isn't defined by how much you give to this, 'cause it's defined by who you are and the love you have for yourself and the world around you." She let out a shaky breath and nodded as the weight of his words settled over her. In that moment, she realized that it wasn't about winning or losing this fight. It was about standing true to herself and the values she held dear. It was about fighting for change, but also knowing when to protect her peace. Her father stood up and extended a hand to her. "Are you ready to keep going?" She looked at his hand, then back at him, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "I am," she said quietly. "Let's keep fighting." And with that, they both knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The resolution. It was weeks before the storm finally began to subside. The hate and vitriol that had followed the campaign video was still there, but slowly and surely, the tide began to turn. She could feel the shift, a subtle undercurrent of change that began to ripple through the public's consciousness. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. The girl had faced down the worst of it, the cruelest of the messages, the most hateful of the attacks, and yet she had stood firm, and with each day that passed, she felt herself growing stronger, more resolute in her belief that she was on the right path no matter how hard the journey had been. Her father had been her constant anchor through it all. His support never wavered, and his belief in her never faltered when the days grew darker. He reminded her why they were doing this, why they had chosen this fight, and in those moments she found her strength again. One evening as they sat together in the living room, the silence between them was comfortable. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't filled with the tension of the past weeks. It was simply a quiet understanding, a recognition that they had made it through the worst part of this battle together, and now it was time to move forward. Her father broke the silence first, his voice quiet, but filled with pride. "You've done more than I ever could have dreamed. You've stood up for what's right, and shown the world what courage truly looks like." She smiled faintly, but there was no pride in her eyes. Not yet. She wasn't finished. She knew there was more work to do, and the work would never truly be done until the world could see everyone for who they truly were, and not who society told them they were. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice steady, but filled with gratitude. Her father chuckled softly. "That's what I'm here for, to make sure you never forget how strong you really are." But even with his reassurance, she knew there was more to it than that. There was more at stake here than just this fight against hate. There was a deeper truth she had uncovered along the way, and it had changed her forever. She had spent years trying to be seen, trying to prove that she belonged, but through all the battles and the harsh words she had learned something far more important than anything else. She had learned that her worth wasn't defined by the opinions of others. Her worth was defined by her own understanding of herself, by her own love for who she was. The world could never take that away from her, no matter how hard it tried, no matter how many people tried to break her down or tell her she didn't belong, because she knew now that she was enough, just as she was, and no amount of hate could ever change that. She had learned how to stand tall, not because she was flawless, but because she knew her flaws didn't make her any less valuable. In fact, they made her stronger. They gave her the depth and resilience to keep going even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she continued her work. She didn't stop because she had discovered something more important than the fight itself. She had discovered the power of her own voice and how it could change the world. Her father watched her grow into the person she had always been destined to be, and he knew without a doubt that she was ready to lead. She was ready to carry the torch forward and light the way for others who had been silenced for far too long. One afternoon, as they sat together in their favorite cafe, the same one where the confrontation had happened all those weeks ago, her father turned to her and smiled. "You've come a long way," he said, "and I couldn't be prouder of you." The girl looked around the cafe now, no longer a place of conflict, but a place of healing. She could feel the difference in the air. The way people now looked at her, not with disdain, but with recognition. They saw her not as a threat, but as a force of nature. "I've learned a lot," she replied, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. "And I know the work isn't over, but I also know now that I'm not alone in this fight." Her father nodded. "You never were alone," he said, "and you never will be." The moment felt like a turning point for them both, not just as father and daughter, but as two people who had fought side by side against something much bigger than themselves, something that could have easily torn them apart, but instead had only brought them closer together. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said quietly, looking her father in the eyes with a strength she had never known before. "And I know now that nothing can stop me." Her father smiled, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew that she would continue to fight for what was right, and that no matter what happened next, they would both face it with the same courage and conviction that had carried them this far. "You're ready," he said, "and I'm right here with you every step of the way." And in that moment the girl realized something important, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had started this journey with uncertainty and fear, but now she stood on the other side of it, stronger and more sure of herself than ever before. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found her purpose. Journey had been long, and the fight had been hard, but she had come out the other side, a warrior in her own right. And as she looked to the future, she knew that she would never stop fighting for what she believed in. She would never stop pushing for change, because she knew now that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference. And as she walked out of the cafe with her father by her side, she smiled to herself, because she knew this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of something much greater, something that would continue long after the final chapter had been written.